There are 3 waterfalls spanning the Canadian-USA border that combined make up the famous Niagara Falls. They have a max height of about 170 feet at their highest point, and every second, 700,000 gallons of water tumbles over the edge. The rapids above the falls are some of the strongest and most violent in the world, with a max speed of about 40 miles per hour right before you hit the edge. As a result, no one's allowed to boat or swim in the final 3.2 miles of the Niagara River that feeds into the falls. But back in the day, there was no such restriction. On the evening of July 16th, 1853, 3 men were working on a small barge anchored in the Niagara River about a half-mile away from the edge of the falls. Once they were done with work, the way they would get back to shore is by taking a rowboat and taking it downstream to the small island called Goat Island that sits right on the edge of the falls. Now, in order to get to that island, you would have to traverse the rapids. But it was only a couple hundred feet away, and because they worked here all the time, they had traversed the rapids many times before without incident. But this time, as soon as they got in, one of their oars broke. And so they weren't able to control their boat, and very quickly they got dragged into the rapids, started getting spun around, and then it capsized. Although they desperately tried to swim to shore, the rapids were just too strong, and 2 of the men were swept away to their death. But one man, Joseph Avery, was lucky enough that when he fell in, he drifted down and grabbed onto this tree root that was sticking out of the water. And so he pulled himself about halfway up out of the water, he caught his breath, and he's looking around, and he can't believe he survived. But he wasn't out of the water yet, so to speak, because he was in the middle of these rapids and there was nobody on shore. It was getting late. His 2 buddies have drowned, and when he yelled out, the rapids were so loud nobody could hear him. And the log he was holding onto was totally slick, and so he had to grip it as hard as he could, otherwise he would just slip back into the water. And so all night, with half of his body in the water, he gripped onto this branch as tight as he could and just prayed he would survive. The next morning, when tourists arrived, they noticed Joseph out on this log, and they waved to him, and Joseph, who had used all his strength just to hold onto this log all night, was not only fatigued, but also was becoming hypothermic, and he very carefully removed one hand and he waved back. The tourists immediately notified authorities, and a rescue effort was launched. And because it was too dangerous to take a boat and try to drive down to Avery and pull him out that way, because he was right near the edge of the falls, what they did is they went up to this little bridge that was upstream of Joseph, and they released rafts and small boats, hoping that one of them, just by chance, would get caught up on that log and he could grab it, and then Joseph could climb in, throw the rope out, and get pulled to shore. But unfortunately, after dozens of attempts, nothing came close to Joseph. Their next plan was to tie a long tether onto one boat and then guide it down the river until it reached Joseph. And this worked. But when Joseph climbed into the boat, it immediately began to capsize. And witnesses would say Joseph stood up, and as he was falling backwards, he threw his hands up in the air like he was surrendering. He let out a final scream and then fell under the turbulent waters, and then seconds later, he was swept off the falls to his death. Here is the final photo of Joseph Avery. It was taken by a journalist right before that boat with a tether attached to it arrived in front of him. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single word note. It just said, "damages." Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated, and the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. This is a screenshot of the actual post. It's extremely graphic, and it's since been removed from the social media platform. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. In 1996, 28-year-old Paljor Tawang was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Born and raised in a valley at the foot of the Himalayas, he was chosen to lead the first ever Indian ascent of the north face of the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. He had left school after the 10th grade and joined the highly competitive and prestigious Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Created in 1962 in response to their domineering neighbor, China, the Border Police specialized in high-altitude landscapes. They had to, given that the boundary between India and China ran through the very rugged Himalayan mountain range. 12 years after joining the Border Police, Paljor was an expert climber and very well liked by his peers, making him an obvious candidate for one of the Border Police's most ambitious missions to date. While Paljor's mother was full of pride for her son's work and accomplishments, he didn't think she would be very supportive if she knew how dangerous the mission he was going on was. And so he told her he was climbing a different mountain, although she would find out through friends where he was actually going, and she would plead with him not to go, but Paljor was not about to change his mind. He was excited and he was confident. In May of that year, Paljor said bye to his family, and he and the other hikers set out on their journey. At first, it went extremely well. The weather was perfect, and the men seemed to be having an excellent time. But their luck would not hold. The team's final assault on the north face of Mount Everest was marked by mistakes, bad decisions, and very bad weather. According to the official report on the ascent, those problems started on the morning of May 10th when Paljor and the other 3 climbers woke up late. Instead of leaving base camp at 3:30 a.m. like they were planning to, they didn't leave until 8 a.m., so 4.5 hours late. Making matters worse, the weather continued to deteriorate with a blizzard moving in, creating near zero visibility. But even under the best of circumstances, circumstances, Mount Everest is still a force of nature. The summit may be covered in colorful ropes and flags and climbers with their high-tech, shiny, beautiful gear, accompanied by a small army of Sherpas, but the outward appearance of commercialization is deceptive. Since 1924, at least 300 people have died on Mount Everest. The death-to-summit ratio is a staggering 4%. The extremely high altitude, Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky, not only makes physical exertion extremely difficult, it affects your judgment and decision-making, and not in a good way. Climbers and scientists have a name for the final half mile of Mount Everest. It's called the death zone, because literally, while you're up there, you're dying. Oxygen is so limited up there that your cells just begin to die, and extremely fit people will have heart attacks and strokes and experience debilitating altitude sickness. The conditions are so severe that people have died from exhaustion just standing in line waiting to reach the summit. But one of the biggest killers in the death zone is something called summit fever. When you get to that point in the climb, you are so close to reaching your goal. People will disregard safety and keep going on when really they should turn around and go back. Pal Jor and his 3 teammates were given strict orders to turn around at 3 p.m. if they had not reached the summit yet. But because of their late start, when 3 p.m. rolled around, they were not at the summit, they were in the death zone. One of the climbers who was with Pal Jor was the commander, and so at 3 p.m. when they were supposed to stop and turn around, he was at the very back of the climbing stack. And so he stopped and he yelled up to Pal Jor and the others and tried to get them to stop too so they could go back down, but either they didn't hear him or they just ignored him. Already suffering from frostbite and totally exhausted, he could not go any farther, so he grabbed his radio and he tried to hail them to tell them to stop and come back, but they didn't pick up their radio. And so the commander, after waiting for a few minutes, knew he had to go back down, and so he turned and began the descent. About 30 minutes later, the commander's radio crackled on again, and it was Pal Jor and the others, and they were informing him that they were going to make a push for the summit. They were about an hour away. And the commander said, "Stop, turn around, I'm ordering you to come back down. The weather is only getting worse." But whether they were suffering from summit fever or overconfidence, we don't know. But regardless, they refused. Frustrated and terrified for the other climbers, the commander just continued down the mountain. But 2.5 hours later, his radio crackled again, and this time it was Pal Jor and the others saying they had made it. They were standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The men had not just set a record for India, they had brought immeasurable honor to their country. The news sparked a huge celebration down in the base camp and also in the city of Leh, which is where the border police were located. But the party atmosphere would not last long. Shortly after the victory call, the weather turned from bad to horrible. What would later be known as the blizzard of 1996 had arrived in full fury, and by midnight that night, no one had heard from Pal Jor or the other 2 people he was with. And just a couple of days later, rescue climbers would confirm all 3 men had died. In the years following Pal Jor's death on the north base of Mount Everest, this hopeful and proud young Indian has become a sort of gruesome celebrity and landmark for the thousands of climbers that make it up into the death zone. Except now he's widely known on the internet and amongst people who are passionate about climbing the world's highest peak, not as Pal Jor, one of the first Indians to climb the north base of Mount Everest, but as Green Boots, which is a reference to the bright neon green boots he was wearing when he died. For more than 20 years, he's laid near the top of Mount Everest in a small limestone cave, wearing an orange parka and blue pants, and he's curled on his side with his arms wrapped around him like he's trying to keep himself warm. Since his death, anyone climbing the north face when the snow cover is light would literally have to step over his body to get to the top. But Pal Jor is not the only dead body on Mount Everest. There are over 200 other dead climbers littering the slopes of the world's highest peak. It's just too dangerous and too expensive to try to get them down, and so they stay wherever they died. Which means if you climb Mount Everest, you will literally be climbing over dead bodies on your way to the summit. But of all the bodies on Mount Everest, the most famous by far is Pal Jor. Here is an image of Pal Jor, aka Green Boots. 1976, Mary Gillespie lived in Circleville, Ohio with her husband, Ron Gillespie, and Mary was a bus driver for the local school. And one day, she came home from work and she found a letter that was addressed specifically to Mary. It had no return address and it was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. The letter effectively said,
"We know you're having an affair with the superintendent of the school. You must stop and come clean and tell your husband. If you don't, bad things are going to happen to you. We're watching your house. We know you have children."
Now, Mary was obviously frightened. She was scared for her kids. She was scared for herself. She didn't really know how to react to this letter, so she just ignored it and hoped that it was a hoax and that it would just stop. But a week goes by and she gets another letter. This letter was even more threatening, saying that
if you don't stop this now, we are going to harm you. This is not a joke.
Mary decided to ignore that letter too. But literally the next day, her husband Ron woke up one morning and got the mail and found a letter addressed to him. The letter had no return address and was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, just like the first two letters sent to Mary. The letter to Ron said that his wife was having an affair with the superintendent of the school, and that if he didn't confront her and get her to admit the truth and get it to stop, that Ron's life would be in
grave danger.
Ron is horrified to read this letter. He hadn't suspected anything of his wife. This was very uncharacteristic. And so he went to Mary and he said, "Hey, I got this letter. What is this? I've gotten 2 of these letters and I've just been ignoring it. I didn't know what to do." And she aggressively denied any accusation that she was having an affair. She said, "I'm not doing any of that." And so Ron believes his wife and says, "You know what? I don't know what this is, but I believe you. Let's ignore this. This will go away. I don't know what this is, but it'll go away." A week later, Ron receives another letter addressed to him, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. This letter said,
"Ron, it's been a week and you haven't done anything. You have to get her to admit the truth. Otherwise, not only are we going to put your life in danger, we're also going to broadcast what she's doing all over town on billboards, on radio, and on TV." So
at this point, Ron and Mary are scared. Ron is still standing behind his wife. He believes his wife that she has not had an affair, that this is just some horrible hoax. But they're scared. But they don't really want to go to police yet. They kind of want this to just go away. So their first step is, let's tell some people in our inner circle just to kind of put this out there and see what other people think. And so the 3 people that were closest to Ron and Mary were Ron's sister's husband, named Paul Freshour, and Paul's sister. So it's a little confusing, but those are the players here. And so while Mary and Ron are telling, their inner circle about this anonymous set of letters they've gotten and all the threats involved, Mary starts to think that she might know who's been sending the letters. She has an idea of who it is. Now, we unfortunately don't know who this person is. It's been left out of anything I can find online. But she decides that it's in their best interest to proactively send this person a letter and basically say, "You got to stop, or we're going to pursue legal action." And initially, when they started sending the letters, while it's unclear if they got any sort of response from this person, the letters, the anonymous letters, did stop. But that would all change in August of 1977 when Ron was home one night with the kids, Mary was out, and Ron receives a phone call. He picks up the phone call, and his kids would say that his entire demeanor changed. He went from calm and collected to angry, furious. He's talking to someone, and it's unclear what was said. We don't know exactly what was said or who he was talking to, but when he hung up, he tells his kids that I'm going to go confront the person who's been writing these letters. And so Ron grabs his pistol, gets in his pickup truck, and blazes off down the road. It's like he knew exactly where he needed to go. But literally minutes later, it was discovered that Ron had died. He crashed into a tree, and he died on impact. Now, nobody else was found at the scene. I mean, the sheriff and the police unit that went in to investigate, it was just Ron in a ditch against a tree. But they found that he had fired 1 shot out of his pistol. They don't know who he was shooting at or what he was shooting at, but he fired a shot before he crashed. The sheriff initially suspected foul play, but the sheriff changes his mind. He says, "You know what? Ron was drunk. Ron was 1.5 times over the legal limit. So he was drunk driving and he crashed." But that didn't make any sense because Ron's family said Ron does not drink. And his kids said he hadn't had anything to drink that day. So at this point, the story starts getting very bizarre. After Ron's death, hundreds of other letters, anonymous letters, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, are sent to residents all over Central Ohio, not just Circleville, but all over Central Ohio. And the letters took a turn. Instead of being accusatory of Mary, although there was still some of that, It was the sheriff in Circleville is covering something up. And it was around this time that people started to speculate that perhaps the writer's agenda is not as clear. Initially, it seemed like they were targeting, Mary and Ron. And then when Ron is taken down, they're defending Ron. So following Ron's death, Mary is scared for her life. She just watched her husband die as a result of this horrible situation. And all these letters are pouring in all over central Ohio with the same kind of nasty language about her and her supposed affair with the superintendent of the school. The letters are insinuating that the sheriff is covering something up with her husband's death. Her kind of dirty laundry is being aired out by this anonymous writer all over central Ohio. And this goes on for years. And so finally in 1983, Mary is at a breaking point and she finally admits that she was having an affair with the superintendent of the school. Now, she claims that it happened or it started after the first letters arrived, that it was just a crazy coincidence, but whether or not that's true, it's kind of secondary. And she thought that that would stop the letters, that the first thing that this person wanted was for her to admit this and stop this affair. So she comes out and she admits it and she puts an end to it thinking that's going to do it. But that didn't do anything. It actually made it worse. So in 1983, after she admits what was going on with her and the superintendent, she's on her bus route driving, the kids to school, and she starts noticing these billboards and signs all over her route, condemning her for her actions and saying she's this horrible person. And so she got mad. She went from being kind of a victim and scared to being mad. And so one day in 1983, she pulls over when she sees one of these signs and she gets out, she rips it out. And then when she puts it down, she notices there's a box that's a part of this kind of billboard contraption. And she kind of looks inside and there is a loaded gun that has a wire wrapped around the trigger and the slack's been pulled out of it. Like it's literally ready to fire. And had she been standing at a slightly different angle when she pulled down the sign, it would have fired the gun and it would have shot her. So she calls police. Police show up, they do an investigation, and they look at the weapon, and they can tell that someone very poorly tried to etch off the serial numbers on the weapon so that it couldn't be traceable. But they were able to lift the serial number, and they were able to trace it back to its original owner, who was none other than Paul Freshour. And so the police go to Paul, and they're like, "Is this your pistol?" And Paul was totally cooperative when he was approached. He's like, "Yes. I didn't report it, but that gun was stolen from me. I didn't set up that booby trap." The sheriff, who was the same one who investigated Ron's death, he didn't buy it. And so they made him submit to a handwriting test. It apparently totally swayed the jury. They were like, "You know what? Paul's the guy." And he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 to 24 years in jail. And so Paul goes to jail. And while he's in solitary confinement, more letters are sent out all over central Ohio. And they're all being postmarked out of Columbus, Ohio, even though he is in solitary confinement in Lima, Ohio. But no one wanted to listen to that. Everybody believed that Paul was the guy, even though he's like, "How could I have been writing these letters?" And so for 7 years, these letters are sent all over central Ohio, accusing the sheriff of this cover-up and condemning Mary for what she did. And then when Paul is up for parole, after 7 years, he stands before the parole board and they deny him parole on the grounds that he was sending these letters. Even though he's like, "How could I have been? I've been in solitary confinement most of the time." But they were like, "Too bad, you wrote the letters, see ya." And so he goes back to jail. And it was at this point that Paul he gets a letter. This letter was taunting Paul because they apparently had known that he was denied parole based on him being the writer. And instead of it being written in the first person, like I, it was written we. We are keeping you in jail for as long as we can. Basically saying, "Ha, we know you didn't do it. But we are going to keep you in jail for as long as we can." And they even said,
"That booby trap is not the only one. It's only a matter of time before somebody else finds one, and then you're going to get blamed for that too."
But following that letter, the letters stop. And so for 3 years, Paul remains in jail until he's up for parole again. And since there haven't been any more letters, and no one found any more booby traps, Paul's granted parole. Paul would maintain his innocence all the way until 2012 when he passed away. So in 1993, which was the same year that Paul was released from prison, the very popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries decides to cover this story. As soon as they are beginning to do research on it, they receive a letter from an anonymous person with no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, written in the same style handwriting as the Circleville writer. It said,
"If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay."
And so the staff and crew of this show had a decision to make. Is this a credible threat or not? Do we actually pursue this or not? And they ultimately decided that they had to do it now. And so they go into Ohio and they do their own research and they start questioning people that were involved in this case. And they come across a crucial piece of evidence that more than likely could have potentially kept Paul from going to jail. They discovered that there was another witness that was never brought forward, despite she made herself available. She was not used in the trial and was basically cast aside, but she was a bus driver. And she was on the same route as Mary. And before Mary went to that booby trap sign and ripped it down and almost was shot, this bus driver was ahead of Mary. And when she passed by, she saw there was a yellow, flashy El Camino sports car parked near the sign. And standing outside of the car near the sign was a man who did not match the description of Paul Freshour at all. And when she was interviewed by Unsolved Mysteries in 1993, they were like, "Really? The sheriff? Nobody wanted to talk to you about this?" And she's like, "Yeah, I told them that I'm available and no one wanted to talk to me about it." So Unsolved Mysteries, they air the episode and nothing comes of it. They don't get any more threats. There's nothing. It just gets aired. It's very interesting. And that's that. Really, at this point, you're left with a collection of people, the police included, that fundamentally believe that there is no mystery. It was Paul Freshour. He's the guy that wrote these letters, that set up the booby traps. He went to jail for it, and that's that. But there's another group of people that believe Paul didn't do this, that he went to jail for something he didn't do. And one of those people is a journalist by the name of Martin Yant. And so Martin, along with a large number of people, believe there are 3 additional suspects that should have been looked into or should be looked into now that could have been the writer. The first one is the superintendent of the school, the one that Mary was accused and then admitted to having an affair with. The second was a co-worker of Mary's that apparently was infatuated with her. And then the third one was Paul Freshour's wife. So they were married when the Circleville writer drama unfolded, but they ultimately divorced. She left him and she ended up getting together with another guy. So she's got a boyfriend. And the boyfriend matches the description of the guy standing next to the El Camino at that sign in 1983. And one of this guy's relatives owned a yellow El Camino. But nobody ever followed up. The police aren't looking into it. Paul Freshour is the guy, and they're not about to reopen this case. For me, the letters that got sent out all over central Ohio while Paul is in, solitary confinement, to me, that is like the number one thing that makes me doubt that Paul was the guy. Now, could he have been involved? Certainly. I think that that's definitely possible. But I think that more than likely what we're looking at here is there was more than one writer. Maybe there was a whole group of them, but it's just unclear what their agenda was. And the whole thing is just very confusing. There's lots of people involved, lots of drama. It's like the most epic drama that's unfolded in the most obscure place in the country. But it is what it is, and it's certainly a fascinating mystery, and I would love to hear what your theories are. Was it Paul Freshour? Was it one of the 3 suspects that I just listed off that Martin Yant thinks it was? Or was it something else? I'd love to hear it in the comments. I'll do my best to go through the comments and respond to as many people as I can. If you enjoyed this story, please gently bash the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like today's story, the dark, strange, and mysterious. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, same as my YouTube channel. And I go live over there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I hope to see you over on other channels or here on YouTube or all of them. But either way, I really appreciate your support. And until next time, See you guys. In 2009, Rebecca Aylward was a 14-year-old girl living near Bridgend, Wales. She was very close with her mother and her younger siblings. She was a model student, and she was well-liked amongst her peers. That year, she began spending more and more time with a boy in her grade, 14-year-old Josh Davies, who, like her, was a model student and had many friends. In October of that year, Rebecca's mother asked her if Josh was her boyfriend, and she said yes. Even though she knew her daughter was a bit young to be in a serious relationship, she'd spent enough time around Josh to form a very high opinion of him. He was incredibly kind and generous and protective of Rebecca, and so she was happy for the two of them. In January of the following year, Josh was allowed to stay over for the weekend at Rebecca's house, and Rebecca's mother remembers the two of them having such a good time together, goofing around with Rebecca's younger siblings and painting each other's nails. When Josh left at the end of that weekend, he told Rebecca that it had been the best weekend of his life. After he left, Rebecca couldn't stop smiling. She was in love. But later that day, Rebecca received a very surprising text message from Josh. He told her he didn't want to be in a relationship with her anymore. Rebecca was crushed, and she tried to get an answer out of Josh as to why he wanted to break it off, but he didn't give her one, and instead he began spreading horrible rumors about her at school, and then he went around to all of her friends and told them what a horrible person she was. And so for the rest of that school year, that's how it went. Josh just continued to mercilessly bully Rebecca for no reason. And then behind closed doors, Josh would tell his friends that he not only hated Rebecca, that he wanted to kill Rebecca. But none of his friends took it seriously. In fact, one of his friends even told Josh that if he ever killed Rebecca, he would buy him breakfast. Fast forward to the end of 2010 when the next school year began, and Josh's behavior completely changed. Suddenly, he was being nice and caring to Rebecca and showing a genuine interest in her, and Rebecca, even though this guy had abused her for the past better part of a year, she secretly still loved him, and so before long, she allowed him back into her life. About a month later, on the evening of October 22nd, Josh sent Rebecca a Facebook message asking her if she would meet him the following day in the woods near their home. This was a popular hangout spot for teens, and so to Rebecca, this constituted a date. This would be the first official date since their breakup nearly a year ago, and so Rebecca was excited and told him, sure, I'd love to go. And so the next day, Rebecca got up early to put on her makeup and to get ready and get dressed, and then after she was all dolled up, she said bye to her mom and she headed out to meet up with Josh. Shortly after she left, Rebecca's mom got a bad feeling about this meetup, and so she called her daughter and said, hey, stay on the phone with me until you see Josh. And so the two of them chatted until Rebecca made her way to the edge of the woods, and then she says to her mom, oh, I can see Josh, he's walking towards me, everything is totally fine, I love you, and I'll see you later. After she hung up the phone, Joshua walked up to her, said hello, took her hand, and then walked her back into the woods. That morning, Josh had changed his profile picture on Facebook to be an image of the woods where they were having this meeting. And then also that morning, Josh had texted one of his friends and said, you'll be owing me that breakfast soon. And so Josh led Rebecca for quite a while deep into the woods until he came to a stop. And while they were stopped, Rebecca at some point turned to look at something, and with her back to Josh reached down, grabbed a very heavy rock, and proceeded to beat her to death. Afterwards, Josh called his friends to see what they were up to, and they asked him if he was still with Rebecca. And so Josh is standing over this poor girl's lifeless body, and he says to them, define with. Later that day, Josh brought his best friend into the woods and showed him Rebecca's body. And then less than 24 hours later, that friend would tell police what Josh had done. During Josh's trial, he was completely unfazed, completely emotionless, and was seen smiling for much of it. He said he didn't kill Rebecca, and in fact, he tried to place the blame on his best friend, but the jury saw through it, they found him guilty, and he was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison. To this day, no one knows for sure why Josh killed Rebecca. The only concrete motive anybody can point to is that one of Josh's friends offered him breakfast if he went through with the killing. Here is a photo of Josh with Rebecca shortly before he killed her. At the start of World War II in 1939, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia did its best to stay neutral and out of the war. But on March 25th, 1941, they finally caved to Nazi pressure and signed a treaty that aligned them with the Nazis. 2 days later, Yugoslavian military leaders who were unhappy with this treaty overthrew their government and installed a new king in hopes he would be able to keep their country out of the war. But upon learning of this coup, Hitler issued a directive that classified this new Yugoslavian government as hostile and ordered its invasion. 10 days later, on April 6th, the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia, and then 11 days after that, Yugoslavia surrendered. But despite their speedy victory, the Nazis struggled to maintain control of the country because of local resistance groups that fought them at every turn. One of the primary resistance groups was called the Partisans. 3 months after the Nazis' invasion, a 15-year-old girl named Lipa Radic and her family, who all lived in Yugoslavia, were arrested by the Nazis. 3 of the men in Lipa's family were members of the Partisans, and so had attracted Nazi attention. 20 days later, as the family still sat in jail wondering what the Nazis were going to do to them, undercover partisans broke into the prison and freed them. After getting back home, Lipa, who was totally inspired by the bravery of these partisan warriors, she immediately joined their group. As a partisan, Lipa would serve as a nurse on the front lines, treating and evacuating the wounded, and then at night, she would participate in direct combat against the Nazis. By 1943, when Lipa was just 17 years old, she had become a very hardened warrior. In February of that year, Lipa was leading a rescue effort of all these women and children, and she was walking them up a mountainside to a partisan camp when the Nazis came out of nowhere and surrounded them on all 4 sides. And Lipa, who refused to surrender, expended all of her ammunition defending these women and children until she was eventually captured. The Nazis moved Lipa to a nearby village where they viciously interrogated her, demanding that she give up the names and locations of her partisan comrades, but Lipa refused. After 3 more days of unsuccessfully trying to get Lipa to give up information, the Nazis grew frustrated and sentenced her to death. And so later that day, Lipa was marched out to a tree situated next to a train station, and hanging down from one of the branches was a noose, and under the noose was a table. With her hands tied behind her back and only wool socks on her feet, the 17-year-old girl calmly climbed up onto the table and stared down at the crowd. As the noose was being tied around her neck, the Nazi commander gave Lipa one more chance to give up information about her partisan comrades, and if she did that, they would spare her life. The Nazis had brought out a cameraman to document this execution because their plan was they would distribute the pictures all over the country to scare the partisans into submission, that this is what happens if we catch partisans. And so with the cameras flashing away, Lipa famously turned to face this Nazi commander and glared at him and said, "Those who you're asking about will reveal themselves when they wipe out all of you evildoers to the last man." After this, Lipa was hanged. The pictures of her execution were indeed distributed all around the country, but there was no context or story. It was just some partisan being executed by the Nazis. But eventually, Lipa's story about her defiance and her famous last words found their way into the partisan camp, and suddenly those images of her execution took on brand new meaning. They no longer inspired fear like the Nazis were hoping. They inspired courage and pride and a will to keep fighting. When the Nazis discovered this is what that picture now represented, they tried to destroy all of these pictures, but it was too late. Lipa had already become a national hero. Following her death, the partisans continued to fight the Nazis and eventually helped to defeat them. After the war was over, the partisans were recognized as one of the most effective guerrilla forces in the entire war. On December 20th, 1951, Lipa was posthumously awarded the second highest military award in Yugoslavia, called the Order of the National Hero. Here is the photo of Lipa glaring at that Nazi commander after she's just told him her comrades are going to kill him. In 2017, Steven Weber was a larger-than-life 38-year-old DJ living in Louisiana. That year, through a mutual friend, he met Kenesha Antoine, who was a 38-year-old lawyer also living in Louisiana. And as soon as they met, they immediately hit it off and began dating. They both had always wanted to travel the world, but they never got around to it because life always seemed to get in the way. But now that they had each other, and so therefore had travel partners, they decided they couldn't wait any longer, and so they created a bucket list of all the places in the world they wanted to go. And then over the next couple of years, they began checking places off their list. In 2019, when Kenesha was going to turn 40, they decided they needed to go somewhere really special to celebrate. And so they checked their bucket list to see where they hadn't gone yet, and they ultimately settled on going to East Africa because there was a resort there they had always wanted to stay in. It was called the Pemba Resort, and it was famous for their underwater room. They literally have a 2-story cabin floating 300 meters off the coast. Its main floor is at surface level. It's got a beautiful couch that looks out over the water, and you can take the stairs up to the roof of the main floor where there's another couch and you can stargaze and look out 360 degrees, and there's no other cabins out on the water. You're completely isolated. And then if you go back down to the main floor, there is a ladder that goes straight down 10 meters into the master bedroom, and it's completely underwater. All four walls have these huge windows that look out directly into the beautiful Indian Ocean. To stay in this cabin for one night costs $1,700, and so Stephen and Kenesha decided they would only splurge on it for one night at the end of their Africa trip. So in September of that year, the couple flew out to Africa, and for over a week, they enjoyed sightseeing and going on safaris and eating nice food, and then at the end of their trip, it was time to head out to the underwater room. So they got to the Pemba Resort on the mainland, they checked in, and then they loaded into a boat and were brought out 300 meters to their actual cabin out on the water. And then after the boat left them there, Kenesha got out her phone and began filming. And she filmed as the two walked around and they looked at the amazing view. They went onto the roof and they're looking all around and they're laughing because it's so unbelievably beautiful. And then at some point they make their way down that ladder down into the master bedroom underwater. And the two just can't stop laughing because it was so bizarre and just so incredible being down there. There were fish that were coming up to the glass and just staring at them. They just couldn't believe what they were seeing. And then at some point Stephen makes a joke that a shark was coming, and Kenesha turns around and then sarcastically laughs at him and says, "Oh, okay, haha, yeah, a shark," and then she turns off the recording. A little while later, Stephen leaves Kenesha in the master bedroom and he goes upstairs and he puts on fins and then hops in the water. Kenesha, who's still down in the master bedroom, is surprised when she sees her boyfriend on the other side of the glass out in the Indian Ocean. And so Kenesha just grabs her phone and starts filming him because she knows he's up to something. And then at some point, Stephen pulls out a plastic bag with a handwritten note inside of it, and he presses it up against the glass so she can see what it says. And so Kenesha zooms in on the note, and you can tell from the tone in her voice, she really doesn't know what he's doing, but then there's a pause in the video as she's reading the note. And the note says, "I can't hold my breath long enough to tell you everything I love about you, but everything I love about you, I love more and more every day. Will you please be my wife? Marry me." Kenesha is so astounded at this proposal. You can tell she's almost crying. She's so excited. And so as she just continues to film him, Stephen pulls out a ring and he holds it up to the glass. And now at this point, Kenesha is just beside herself. She couldn't be happier. And so Stephen closes the ring box, he grabs the letter, and he swims up out of view back to the surface. And Kenesha turns off the recording, turns around, runs to the ladder, and climbs up to the main floor to give Stephen her answer that yes, she would marry him. But when she got up there, she looked around and Stephen wasn't up there. And so she's yelling for him, she's looking around, waiting for him to show up, but he's not. And so she runs up onto the roof of the main structure to get a better look around to see where he went. But when she got up there, she looked down and there's nothing but ocean. There's no sign of Stephen anywhere. And so starting to panic, she runs back down to the main floor at surface level, and now she's frantically yelling for Stephen, yelling for him to come up to the surface. Where is he? Where are you? But there's no response. Kenesha is all alone out in this cabin in the middle of the ocean. She has no way to contact anyone on the mainland, and so she has no idea what to do. She doesn't know if she should just jump in the water to go looking for him. She doesn't know if he's maybe playing a joke on her. She just doesn't know what's happening. And so she just reflexively begins screaming out for help, hoping that somebody will hear her and come help her find Stephen. And after a little while, some boaters not too far away hear her yelling out for help. They come over and they, along with Kenesha, begin looking, and they ultimately find Stephen. But by the time they found him, it was too late. He had drowned. The details of exactly how he managed to drown or exactly where he was when they found him are not listed online. Here are the final photos of Steven Weber.